I'm welcoming many of you after you've been already sitting here for half of a day, so you're being welcomed once again. But great to have you here, and I'm glad you could join us for what is going to prove to be a very interesting lunch discussion. You're going to hear from Ambassador Dan Fried in a moment. But first of all, welcome to the Wilson Center. Great to have you here in what we consider a trusted space where you can hear different points of view on important salient global issues, and clearly today's discussion falls well within that. Before I turn it over to John Hempelman, who will introduce our speaker, let me welcome not only Ambassador Fried, we're glad to have you here, Ambassador Fried, also Meg Linsager, who's a scholar here at the Wilson Center, a visiting fellow, and formerly the U.S. Representative at the IMF. A huge thanks to the Kennan Institute, Matt Rajansky and Will Pomerantz. I just lost Will, but there he is. Will and Matt, who really organized this event, and appreciate all your work on this. This is something that they've been working on and writing on extensively over the past few months, and it is an issue that we care a great deal about here at the Wilson Center. And of course to the Jackson Foundation, the Henry M. Jackson Foundation. Thank you. It's great to be able to partner with you again on this. And without further ado, let me turn this over to John Hempelman, who is the president of the Jackson Foundation. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Andrew.
If I put it here, can they still hear you?
Also, welcome to you all again from the Henry M. Jackson Foundation. As you heard this morning in my opening comments, this is a very, very relevant subject as the foundation seeks to continue to advance the legacy of Scoop Jackson, very, very influential man of his time. And of course, as you know, you heard a little bit, and you'll hear a little bit more, the author of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment to the Trade Act of 1974, where we explicitly linked our economic and fiscal policies to what was going on inside of the Soviet Union. And as Ambassador Fried reminded me at lunch here, unfortunately the senator died before he saw the incredible success of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and those millions of Soviet Jews and Orthodox Christians and Catholics who were able to emigrate from the Soviet Union because of his actions. We are extraordinarily fortunate in this discussion about the effectiveness. Our program title is The Effectiveness of U.S. Sanctions, but I was very, very impressed with Richard Wood's discussion in the panel this morning about the critical role that the European Union plays in worldwide sanction policies. Very impressed. So it's generally the effectiveness of sanctions. Ambassador Fried started, I'm going from the bottom up. Normally you go from the top down, but I'm going to go from the bottom up because as I read the background about the ambassador, who started at State in 1977, I was struck by the remarkable number of times this career diplomat has been in the right spot or the hot spot at the right time. Because he started his career as the Soviet Union was breaking up, and therefore was very, very deeply involved in how Europe evolved, and was multiple presidents and Secretary of State's man on the spot in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, and helped define our policy there. So shortly after he took on that work, he was appointed ambassador to Poland. He also, in that period of time, was a senior advisor to the president and a member of the National Security Council. And then, as if to reward him for his good work, the president established him as the special envoy to shut down Guantanamo Bay. I mean, like, thank you very much. Can I give you a reward? Fortunately, he is now the coordinator for sanctions policy and an ambassadorial rank here, an extraordinarily important job today. And in the year or two ahead, as you heard this morning, We all know what's happening on, and we, to some extent, have some hope on the Iranian front. As the speakers this morning said, on the Russian front, the jury is still out on the effectiveness of sanctions. So we're going to hear from the ambassador here at lunch now on the U.S. view on sanctions policy, and we'll be able to take questions. I want you to know this, the ambassador will speak for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll be able to take questions before we return to the auditorium. So, Ambassador Fried, incredibly pleased to have you here.
A digression on Scoop Jackson. I was of the foreign policy generation back in the 70s that witnessed the debate, and Jackson possessed a profoundly correct strategic insight, which was that a country's internal behavior, its treatment of its own citizens, was linked to its external behavior, its behavior in the world, which now we take for granted, but at the time was seen as a dangerous, destabilizing, interfering proposition. And that was the insight, to say so in the presence of Richard Pearl's a little dangerous, but it was that insight that led to the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and much else. The relationship between domestic and foreign policy is something I'll get into later. But to sanctions. Matt Rojansky asked me whether I was going to preach the gospel of sanctions today. Now, sanctions are kind of the new policy kid on the block, the cool kid, popular. Iran sanctions are touted as the answer to all our problems, but of course, people who do that now, sometimes 3 years ago, were saying sanctions would never work. The fact is, sanctions can be a useful tool. Used well, they can be effective, but they're only as good as the policy they are designed to advance. That's it. They're a tool, not an end in themselves. So why sanctions? Why do we use sanctions? First, we use them to change behavior, that is, to alter the decision-making calculus of a government or a non-state actor. That means, that implies that sanctions should be temporary and should be designed to be lifted when the behavior you don't like has ended. Second thing we use sanctions for is to actually constrain behavior, to make it more difficult for a government or a non-state actor to do bad things. Like, for example, we apply sanctions to North Korea to make it harder for the North Koreans to procure nuclear-sensitive material. A third thing we use sanctions for is to stigmatize, to make clear that a certain activity is illegitimate. So we have sanctions against the Taliban. They're not very effective, but the asset freeze and the travel ban, because they are UN imposed, stigmatize the Taliban, and that gives us some political leverage. Now, look, those are very general principles. In my office, the Sanctions Office, which just got established 2 years ago, we've developed a sanctions do's and don'ts, a rough guide and a dynamic list. We're always changing them. But sanctions, I'm going to start with sanctions don'ts. Don't be in a hurry. Sanctions take time, and they, in particular, do not accommodate themselves to the news cycle or the American political cycle. Okay? They don't. Don't be greedy. Don't impose sanctions looking for a glorious win. You may get it, you may not. You probably won't. Sanctions don't have to result in the other party putting up the white flag to be effective. In sanctions, don't look for purity. Sanctions sometimes have unintended consequences. They have costs. Now, these can be mitigated, they can be managed, but they can't be wished away. This is real life. And in policy, everybody's always looking for the no risk, all gain option to send up to the president. It never exists. And don't default to sanctions. Now, sanctions are sometimes the middle ground between passivity and invasion. Now, maybe, but that doesn't mean that they're the best tool just because they're the middle option of three. Okay? So given all that, what are the do's of sanctions? First, multilateral sanctions are better. I didn't say best, I said better. UN Security Council resolutions imposing sanctions are the gold standard. They're great. They're universal. They have legitimacy. It's fine. And on the North Korea, they're pretty extensive. But Security Council resolutions are not the only standard. The second best is regional and widely adopted sanctions, starting with the G7 and the US and the European Union. This touches on a larger issue of legitimacy. Doing things through the Security Council is, in principle, better if you can do it. Given the structure of the Security Council and the veto principle, you can't tie yourselves to that in all cases. Multilateral is better, unilateral is the weakest, but if I can use the phrase with an unfortunate history, sanctions coalitions of the willing. If the willing includes the world's great democracies, the G7 and the European Union, that's pretty good too. Smart sanctions are essential. Sanctions should hit where they have the right balance of impact. You try to hit the other guy. You don't hit yourself, you don't hit your friends. Go after the right people, the right companies, the right sectors. Consider local conditions when you determine the right combination of travel bans, arms embargoes, and financial sanctions. Deal with the unintended consequences when sanctions hit friends and partners. Fix problems. Invest in sanctions capacity. Doing smart sanctions requires resources. Now, I'm not from Treasury, but so I can say this. Treasury has a first-rate bureaucracy dealing with sanctions. OFAC is good. And we shouldn't take good bureaucracies for granted. Think what happens when you have a bad bureaucracy. OFAC didn't spring up overnight. It takes resources. There's no substitute for the ability to develop targets, pick them, defend them in a court of law, analyze the impact, deal with exceptions, cleaning up problems. Make messaging clear, which I heard came up this morning. Be explicit as to why certain individuals and entities are being sanctioned, and in particular, what it will do to end sanctions. And then that requires you to know when to end them. Never forget what it is you set out to achieve through sanctions. Figure it out in advance, the better to know when to wind them down. Finally, in sanctions, you have to mean it. You have to mean it. They are not a cost-free tool. To maintain sanctions, you have to invest serious political capital at home and abroad. You will get pushback if you impose sanctions that counts, from companies, lobbyists, foreign governments, and from within, from people and groups, both principled and otherwise. Sanction when you're willing to go the distance. Mean it. Now, in addition to this, sanctions have long-term drawbacks. Sanctioning, the sanctions actor, the sanctioner, had better wield serious economic power. The dollar is by far the world's largest reserve currency, and that gives U.S. financial sanctions muscle. Technology sanctions also have muscle because if you have the US, Europe, Japan, G7 imposing certain sanctions, you can make that effective. Overuse of sanctions can trigger tactical retaliation, which may or may not be effective, but also strategic retaliation in the form of long-term steps to limit the dollar's reach. Now, that doesn't mean that Vladimir Putin will have the ruble substituting for the euro anytime soon. But it does mean that sanctions as a tool of the strong, our tool, require us to keep our strength commensurate with our ambition. Cautionary notes, right? I mean, I'm the sanctions guy, so sanctions are theoretically my bureaucratic rice bowl, but honestly, my office spends a lot of time trying to talk people out of sanctions options because they have drawbacks. Now, my office does sanctions worldwide. My deputy does Iran sanctions. I do Russia sanctions. And that's what I want to talk about. A Russia sanctions regime is the biggest sanctions regime we've ever had in terms of size of the sanctioned economy. And the decision to sanction Russia was huge, and that enormity is often overlooked. A decision by the US, the European Union, and the G7 to sanction Russia reverses the direction of our policy, of Western policy toward Russia, really since the Reagan second term, and certainly since the first President Bush. The precipitating factor was not just us being mean, if you listened, which is the impression you get if you listen to RT. The precipitating factor was Russia's turn from an unevenly reforming convergence state, as we thought it, to a revisionist and authoritarian aggressor. And I'd like to use this platform to dispense with self-serving Russian arguments of grievance and resentment. The West and 5 US presidents, starting with Ronald Reagan, sought to build better relations with Russia. Reagan, Gorbachev, Clinton, Yeltsin, Bush, Putin, even through the Russo-Georgian War, and then President Obama's reset. 5 very different US presidents, all reaching out to Russia. Russia's aggression against Ukraine, the first territorial seizure in Europe by one country against another since World War II, has weakened, if not undone, the strategic assumptions of a generation. We are all dealing with and thinking about the consequences. Russia is, in fact, behaving as a revisionist power, and what it is seeking to revise are the post-Cold War arrangements that brought freedom and prosperity to over 100 million Europeans and made Europe whole, free, and at peace a reality for the first time in history. And that Europe is on the line. That is why we have imposed sanctions. Sanctions have been the pillar of our response to this challenge. And in imposing these sanctions, we have tried to follow our own precepts. These sanctions are multilateral. Well, not Security Council, we weren't going to get that, but the core has been the US and the European Union working together and working with G7 allies. Now, working together can cover a multitude of actions, but in this case, by working together, I mean we consulted in advance, we, the US, consulted in advance and allowed our decisions to be informed by ideas we heard from Europe, often good ideas. We worked with European governments and with the European Commission in detail in advance. It was worth it. It was unusual for sanctions. We usually don't do that. We did it in this case. We're glad we did. Our sanctions were designed to be smart. In energy, we hit Russia's future oil production through restrictions on frontier technology, not current sales. In finance, we did some blocking sanctions, but we used a more subtle set of debt and equity restrictions, which, by the way, was an idea we heard from the Europeans, all right? Richard Wood knows this perfectly well. Our theory was to impose a slow squeeze on the Russian economy rather than trigger a destabilizing crisis. At each stage, we analyzed the balance of risks and benefits and cost to Russia before we made a move. These sanctions are intended to advance a specific policy: the support of Ukraine's sovereignty and Ukraine's right to find its own way, if it can, as a reforming and converging state. And in particular, our sanctions are in support of the Minsk package of agreements to end this crisis. Now, the way out of sanctions is clear, and it is agreed when and if the Russians fulfill their obligations under the Minsk package, the most important element of which is the restoration of the Ukrainian international border in the east, sanctions can start coming down. The Minsk package consists of a ceasefire, withdrawal of Russian weapons and forces, and especially from the Ukrainians, significant and specified decentralizing reforms and some local autonomy for Donetsk and Luhansk. And finally, as I said, restoration of the international border. Ukraine has adhered to its obligations under Minsk, including decentralizing legislation and the beginning of the Minsk-mandated constitutional reform process, and it has done so under conditions of occupation and invasion by its neighbor. And yet the Ukrainians have maintained the political mandate to go ahead with reforms, and this is impressive. I cannot say the same about Russia's adherence to Minsk. Its forces are present in Ukraine, whatever President Putin may claim. Heavy Russian equipment is still flowing across the international border. There has been a relative lull since the Russian attack after Minsk was signed on Debaltseve, but we cannot take this as the norm. Fighting has intensified recently, even as Russian forces are increasing their presence on the Ukrainian border. According to Minsk's own terms, restoration of the international border, the key step to resolve Russia's aggression, will not occur before the end of the year, and it was backloaded at Russian insistence. Therefore, sanctions should be extended until at least that time. Now, that is not just the American position, that's the European Union position, which on March 19th agreed to those principles. That was a strong position. That wasn't a minimal position. That was a good position, and the United States supports it. Consensus exists along the above lines, as I've laid them out, between the US, the EU, and the G7. And I want to say something about the European Union. It is a cottage industry in this town and in some European capitals to scoff at European political will, to suggest that the European Union cannot think strategically and cannot maintain a strong policy where it counts. At each stage in the Ukraine crisis, European unity and strength has been demonstrated. The Europeans have held to sanctions despite a range of views within the European Union and despite heavy lobbying by the Russians. Europe showed more resolve and more strategic coherence than many thought likely, including some Europeans, some Americans, and I suspect many Russians. And this is a major achievement of European foreign policy and worth pointing out. The Russians are still lobbying. The Greek government says what it says. There are other sanction skeptics in Europe. But nevertheless, at each turn, the Europeans have done the right thing. Now, do sanctions work? Are these sanctions working? Skeptics point out accurately that Russia is still occupying Ukraine and is likely to hold Crimea through its illegal attempted annexation, even if Minsk is fulfilled. But we cannot expect sanctions to lead to Russia running up the white flag. The relevant question is, are sanctions against Russia changing the context in which Putin is making decisions about Russia's next step? Would we have achieved the Minsk package, even with its weakness of implementation and its own ambiguities, without sanctions? And consider the alternative. If there were no transatlantic unity and no agreed sanctions, what would Putin have then concluded about the character and strength of the West? Would we then face more than occupied Crimea and part of Donbass? Would Russia have grabbed more, and would we face a full-fledged puppet state of Novorossiya, stretching all the way to Crimea or further? You can't know, but I'm suggesting what I think and what we think. With sanctions, don't be in a hurry and don't be greedy. They can help, but they won't solve problems by themselves. If we maintain them, the impact of the sanctions on Russia will be felt more strongly over time. Russian sanctions have contributed to a weakened and stressed Russian economy and major drops in Russian reserves. The Russian sanctions can buy time and space for Ukraine to implement the reforms it must implement to survive as a sovereign state. Sanctions may, in the end, push Russia to settle in Ukraine on terms consistent with our bottom line, a sovereign Ukraine. Maybe we'll get there. And the possibility of a good outcome, which exists, is worth investing in. As a foreign policy professional, I can tell you there are not a lot of foreign policy problems where a good outcome is still on the table. It usually begins with bad and gets worse. That's the spectrum. In Ukraine, we have the opportunity to achieve good. That's worth investing in. That's what this government is committed to, working with Europe. So maybe we'll get there. Thank you.
We have 17 minutes for questions. I'm going to ask you to keep it short and to ask a question, please, no statements. Yes, ma'am. Right here.
Sharon Bogat, Voice of the Modern. I write for Women Under 3360. The American public seems to be, they're having time to understand foreign policy. And what I've gathered is, well, not gathered, but my readers have told me that they need it in one paragraph. They like sanctions because they understand sanctions. So the average American person seems to like the sanctions programs. How would you explain it to somebody, a relative, one paragraph quickly, what you do and why it's important? Thank you.
How do you want to work this, question and answer, or collect the questions?
No, go ahead.
Okay. In one paragraph, sanctions are an economic policy tool intended, as I said, to push governments, to put pressure on them, short of military action. That's why we use it.
Okay. Next question. Richard. Here comes the mic.
In the bargaining that surrounds the potential lifting of these sanctions versus various Russian policies, shouldn't we add a dimension by assisting the Ukrainians to defend themselves? Shouldn't we be giving them some means to raise the cost to Russia of further depredation?
I'm so glad I'm just the sanctions guy. It is interesting that a number of my colleagues, Foreign Service officers who served in Ukraine, and Strobe Talbot made exactly that case publicly. That is being debated, famously so, within this administration. You can make arguments for and against. The argument against is that Russia has escalation dominance, and no matter how much you give the Ukrainians in terms of heavy military hardware, it won't work. The argument for is you're not trying to arm the Ukrainians to defeat Russia. You're trying to make it more costly for Russia to move deeper into Ukraine. That's roughly the terms of the debate. Happily, sanctions can work if they deter Putin from a resumption of aggressive military action. It can have that effect. So I can't answer your question except to say that it's being debated. It's a fair one.
Daniel Dresner, the Fletcher School, Tufts University. You are now the head sanctions guy at the State Department, so I'm going to ask you a dream question. If you could change one piece of U.S. law to make sanctions easier to implement, what piece would that be?
That is so dangerous. Tempting. Look, in general, the United States has the legal framework we need to impose the sanctions we want. The Congress, the Ukraine Freedom Support Act, we supported because it gave us discretion without mandates, which would complicate our lives. The Iranian sanctions laws, as they emerged after heavy negotiations, ended up okay also. What we don't like are sanctions laws that would keep us from using sanctions as an effective tool. You have to be able to take them down as well as maintain them. And if you're always moving the goalposts and are unable to take them down, you will end up with unilateral sanctions, dumb sanctions. So if you're asking me for a legal hard line, if I could impose it, which I can't, it would be that.
Next question is from Matthew Organski, Director of the Canaan Institute.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fried. Much better than preaching any gospel. I think you gave us clarity that we so rarely get in discussion of sanctions more broadly than the rest of the world. I pay close attention to your three rationales: changing decision-making calculus, constraining behavior, state council. My sense is that of those three, the first two, which are these probably arguably the more important ones in terms of policy outcome, have done an accurate reading of how the other side works, how the elites think, how society thinks, things even like culture, politics, etc. Given that for the last 25 years, we haven't gotten a great many of the outcomes that we have wanted with Russia, do you think we have an accurate reading on how Russia works?
The Russians, of course, currently deny that the sanctions will affect their calculation about Ukraine whatsoever. But they would say that. If we succeed in Ukraine, it will probably not feel like a success. The Russians would claim victory of some kind in any event, and we have to be prepared for that. The Russians, I believe the Russians are perfectly rational within their own frame of reference, given their objectives, which, and I express my problem with their frame of reference and their objectives. But by increasing the risks to the Russian economy and putting consistent pressure on the Russian economy, we can affect the calculations so they're more likely to take the deal like Minsk, that after all has something in it for them if they want that deal. Okay, you can't expect sanctions to have Putin say, yeah, I'm whipped, I'm walking away. That won't happen. But an outcome which leaves Ukraine sovereign and free is a good outcome. Our knowledge of Russia is imperfect. It was imperfect during the Cold War, but the Cold War turned out well for us and bad for them. And and as an old student of Russian history, I wonder why the Russians seem so eager to go for round two, considering how round one ended for them. But ask them.
I was going to go to the other side of the room. Yes, Ted.
Thank you. Speaking of dumb sanctions, I wanted to get your take on the last 3.5 months vis-a-vis U.S. sanctions on Cuba and Venezuela, and any ideas about where we may be headed in the future, given that the Congress controls a lot of what might happen in the future. Thank you.
Well, I guess Cuba sanctions, as President Obama said and others have said, 50 years of failure should be sufficient. I'm not sure I agree with the characterization of the Venezuela sanctions. Those were very narrowly targeted to individuals responsible for human rights abuses. Let's see how this plays out, not in the immediate backwash, but over time. So I'd say jury is still out on that one. On Cuba, we've embarked on another path, and we will see what that dynamic brings. I worked on Soviet policy during the second Reagan term. And one of Reagan's strategic insights, which was profoundly right, was that democracy really is a superior form of government. And this was not necessarily the views of the whole American center-right and right at that time. But the consequence of that is that Reagan had a confidence that if you engage on your terms, or partly on your terms, and keep human rights front and center in your engagement and your rhetoric, you can come out ahead. Now, saying that is easy, doing it is difficult. Secretary Shultz was wonderful at this because he articulated a policy under which we could engage in arms control with the Soviet Union and outreach to Gorbachev, while at the same time putting rather severe pressure on the Soviet military in Afghanistan and pursuing human rights and pushing back in Central America and not tying ourselves up with problems of linkage. Linkage was their problem, in Schultz's view. And that is, I've thought of that several times in the past months as the debate about Iran and the debate about Cuba has unfolded, which is not to say it's easy. It's easier to articulate a formula, as I just did, than to implement it.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Question over here. Okay.
Thank you. Yulia Bila from the Carnegie Endowment. You had mentioned the importance of messaging and making sure the other side really understands why sanctions are being implemented, and that hasn't necessarily been successful in the case of Russia. Is that because of something that the State Department is doing incorrectly, or because the White House should be more involved, or how do we remedy that situation?
I think the messaging to the Russians over Ukraine has been perfectly clear. We've been explicit about what they need to do to get sanctions taken off. The Obama administration has, the innovation of the Obama administration in this case was to do sanctions in consultation with Europe. And basically my instructions as the sanctions negotiator were to come up with sanctions that worked in their own terms and were developed in concert with Europe. Now that was an innovation, and that was the right call. That's worked out. So both sides of the administration policies so far have been reasonably successful. The Russians aren't ready to hear that message. Why? I mean, from their point of view, I suppose, why should they settle for anything less than domination of Ukraine until they have to? Which suggests that sanctions may have to be increased, which I think they would be if the Russians re-engaged in a military offensive such as an attack on Mariupol. And I also think that there's a realization in Europe that that's the case.
panel this morning ended with a question to Richard Wood, which was then said, well, ask it of Ambassador Fried at lunch. The question to Richard was, what happens if the European Union lifts the sanctions at the end of the year? What will the U.S. do? Tough question.
Oh, ask me when we get there. That's, if there were a failure, I have a fair amount of confidence in Europe because of the track record so far. And I think much will depend on what happens between now and then. There are three ways it could go, right? You could have a renewed Russian big military offensive in Ukraine. In that case, I believe the United States and Europe would impose more sanctions with the G7. We've said publicly that the costs will rise. And I can tell you that we and the Europeans have been talking about the different scenarios. We're not starting from scratch. A second scenario, the one we hope for, is that Russia increasingly, as much as reality will allow, adheres to Minsk, that you have the implementation, that the Russians in their own way are seeking a way out, and we get to the end of the year and we actually are in a position to start lifting sanctions. That's good. A third is that you have a clouded view of non-adherence to Minsk short of major military offensive, a kind of salami slice chipping away at Minsk. Sanctions don't maintain themselves. You need to maintain them, and we need to keep the pressure on. The end of the year is a ways away, and the answer to that question is what's happening on the ground. But I can tell you the U.S. will consult with Europe in general and with the our key European allies and others in particular.
Will, last question.
You talked about Russia's fulfillment of the Minsk agreements. I'm just curious if you could, from your perspective, think looking forward about Ukraine's fulfillment of the Minsk agreements, because there are lots of demands still that Ukraine has to fulfill, at least on paper. So as you proceed over the next 6 months, are you confident, for example, that the Minsk II talked about amnesties, it talked about trade between Donetsk, Luhansk, and Russia. Is Ukraine at this point really moving towards the fulfillment of Minsk as well?
Yes, they are. For example, the Ukrainian parliament has already passed a law providing for local autonomy, including special arrangements between Donetsk, Luhansk, and Russia. They have done so under these conditions, which is remarkable. They have started the constitutional process of decentralization, again, under these conditions. Ukrainian fulfillment of Minsk is far greater than that of the Russians. They are actually doing it. The Russian narrative, of course, is that they are not, but the Russians would say that. The Russians say a great many things. The Russians said that they had no troops in Crimea until Putin admitted that they did and bragged about it. Having been lied to so profoundly, maybe we should take Lavrov's assertions with a certain skepticism. But the Ukrainians have actually done their piece. They need to convince people that they are doing it. That's true. But they are fulfilling Minsk. They are also separately trying to push through some profound reforms. For example, raising the price of natural gas for home heating and industrial use to market levels in 3 years. Not easy to say, hard to do. They're carrying their weight, and they're doing so when there are Russian troops on their territory. Look, I don't romanticize the Ukrainians having followed their history since '91 and the failure of the Orange Revolution in '04. That said, this is the most credible reformist team they've ever had. The last Ukrainian elections marginalized the extremists rather than voted them in. I don't want anyone to fall for the Russian line that they're fascists in Ukraine. The extremists were pushed into a corner. This is the best hope that the Ukrainians have. In fact, I haven't seen a post-communist European Parliament act with such desperate courage since the Poles in the fall of 1989, who thought that they were all going down. And so they might as well pass the best reform package they could because they'd all be in the gulag in 6 months. That's what they assumed then. Turned out pretty well. Do I think the Ukrainians will end up as good as the Poles? Well, at least nobody thought the Poles would end up as well as they did at the time. I can't tell you how many meetings I went to in and out of government where the Polish chance of success was dismissed with the same certainty that Ukrainian success is being dismissed in many corners of Washington today. That doesn't mean the Ukrainians will succeed. I don't know that they'll succeed. They could fail. I know that they might, that it is possible for them to succeed. And that possibility is worth investing in and worth sanctioning to increase the odds. Let's thank our ambassador.
That was terrific. Very, very enlightening, extremely well done. Now, let's all work our way back into the auditorium. We're starting that program theoretically in 2 minutes, but maybe we can do 5. I really enjoyed it.